Well, welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized into a set of thematic courses. I am Tish Futrell, the Director of Academic Engagement on the Lifelong Learning Team. Thank you so much for joining our program, Food Science, Genomics to Markets. This program is part of our theme, Food for Thought, which will examine the many facets of our relationship with food through scientific, cultural, policy, and health lenses. Today's program is the first session in our Food for Thought series that will explore the triumphs and challenges of plant-based science and what that might mean for the future of our food. Joining us today as our host and moderator is Martin Smith, George M. Woodwell Distinguished Professor of Environmental Economics in the Nicholas School of the Environment. Marty studies the economics of the oceans and works primarily on bioeconomics of the fishery, economics of global seafood markets and trade, and economics of coastal climate change adaptation. He has served as the editor-in-chief of the journal Marine Resource Economics. He's also been the president of the International Institute of Fisheries, Economics, and Trade, and has served as the chair of Duke's master's program in environmental economics and policy. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Marty.
Thanks, Tish. Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I'm really excited to talk about the future of food and a number of the really interesting scientific issues surrounding those questions. As Tish pointed out, I work on the economics of oceans. And for a long time in my career, I've always been interested in this intersection of biology and economics. I do what's called bioeconomics. It's a little bit like what it sounds like. We put together economics with population dynamics and understand these systems together. So in fisheries, you can't understand how a fish population is going to evolve over time if you don't understand the economic sector that's driving the fishing. And similarly, you can't understand what the fishers are going to do if you don't know what's going on with the biology. So it's a topic that's sort of near and dear to me to put these things together and also to think more broadly about how food, such as seafood, fits into the broad food system. So today we're here to talk not just about seafood, we're here to talk about all food. And we're going to span some scales. We're going to go all the way from the molecular level with the genome of plants and animals, and then talk maybe a little bit about how that works its way all the way into global markets and eventually into the products that we consume. So I'm really pleased to introduce our two panelists for today, and then they're going to tell you a little bit about themselves in a second, and then we'll get into some details about their research. So first up is Shengyang He. He's the Benjamin E. Powell Distinguished Professor of Biology. And our other panelist is my colleague here in the Nicholas School, Zachary Johnson, who is the Julie Plant Granger Associate Professor of Biological Oceanography and Marine Biotechnology. So Shengyang, if you could say a few words about yourself and who you are, and then we'll turn it over to Zachary for a bit.
Sure. Thank you, Marty. Hi, everyone. So as Marty indicated, I'm a professor in the biology department here at Duke. Particularly, I study plants and how plants fight against diseases and pests. So recently, we also venture into how climate change is impacting the ability of plants to fight against pathogens and pests. So as you probably know, one of the most serious barrier to global food production is actually disease and pests. And this has been impacted by climate change. So, people are worried about that. Globally, up to 40% of crop yield is lost every year to disease and pests. This is a huge issue. It got attention to the United Nations that designated a few years ago as the year of plant health. So it's up there. So my lab is part of the newly established center called the Climate Plant Innovation Center. The goal of this center is to develop innovative technology at Duke here to produce a new generation of plants that will be resilient to climate change, including disease and pests. So I'm excited about that. My lab also work on plant microbiome. So if you have any questions about that, and these are beneficial microbes that help plants to fight against the disease and pests. So today I really look forward to discussing with you or communicating with you about food production. And so, Marty, I think that's my introduction of myself.
That's perfect. Thank you, Xinyang. Zachary, you want to give us a little bit about your work?
Absolutely. Zachary Johnson, associate professor. I'm actually based at the Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. So we're a field station that's about 200 miles from the main campus in Durham. My research has, my lab focuses on marine algae, the single cell plants that are the engine of the ocean. And so we have kind of two basic arms of research. One is oceanographic, where we go into the ocean, whether local or global, and look at the abundance, diversity, and activity of those plants that, again, are driving those systems that ultimately end up as fish food for Marty's fish. But we also have an applied aspect where we're taking the core fundamental aspects of those marine algae and trying to leverage those as a food production system, and more generally a sustainable commodity system. And so for that, so we have some larger scale work that I'll elaborate on later.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Zachary. And before we kind of get into some more of those details, I want to give a little bit of scaffolding, a little overview just of where science plugs into our food system. So I think most of you know that humans have domesticated wild plants and animals for thousands of years, but really in the last 100 years or so has food production truly exploded. And scientific breakthroughs have in large part driven this explosion, ranging from systematic application of experimental methods to selective breeding, development of new crops, disease and pest management, development of synthetic fertilizers, new techniques in precision agriculture, and of course, since the revolution in molecular biology, the development of genetically modified foods. A late arrival to this party, and in my neck of the woods, is the farming of fish, or what we call aquaculture, which has been done again for thousands of years, but really only recently has taken off as a major source of food. And it's playing catch up, but it has been the fastest growing food sector since the 1970s. Nevertheless, despite all this innovation, growth in food production is slowing across many sectors. Some scholars argue that we have simply found all the low-hanging fruit that's out there, and major new innovations will require going further and further into the use of molecular techniques. Not everyone agrees with that. At the same time of this slowing of growth in food production across sectors, we face a number of other challenges. Our global food system presents environmental challenges while also producing major global health challenges. Food production is a major contributor to global climate change, and at the same time, a lot of global food production is stressed by climate change. Although our food system in the current time produces enough calories to feed the world, food is a major contributor to diseases of affluence such as heart disease and diabetes, while protein and micronutrient deficiencies persist in many other parts of the world. Some argue that scientific innovations in food production and what kinds of foods we produce, particularly, could address these problems both in environmental sustainability and in human health. So, of course, there are a lot of scholars interested in using science in order to pursue these objectives. And we're very, very fortunate today to have two natural scientists working in pretty different areas, but I think in areas that are very relevant to these questions. So what I want to do first is sort of go one by one and ask each of you to tell us a little bit more about your research, drill into a little bit of the details, and specifically how your research relates to the future of sustainable food production, or possibly will relate to the future of sustainable food production. So let's go back to Xinyang first.
Sure, I can maybe give a couple examples that my lab has done in the recent years. So We are, as I said, I'm really interested in climate interface with crop production. And so one of the problem is that when the temperature warming up, which we experience it more and more now throughout the world, a lot of plants don't do it very well. So we start to feel like some of the very familiar food we eat may not be produced reliably. And that's a major concern. It's a major concern felt first by scientists because we are witnessing this in the very front lines. Consumers probably don't see that until much later. So we have to figure out solutions to that. So one of the things we have been doing in the lab at Duke is to try to figure out how to make plants more tolerant to temperature. Normally, for instance, you grow soybean at a temperature of 28 degrees, which is fine. But now we're experiencing 37 degrees, and you have this yield drop. In 2050, world population going to hit 10 billion people. We need to produce 70% more food. As Marty just said, all the low-hanging fruit has been harvested by us in the past hundreds of years through domestication. So what we're doing now, try to use genomics to really harness the wild relative of crop plants. So if we think about again, soybean was domesticated from other related species many hundreds of years ago, but we lost a lot of good traits. And so now we are going back into genomics to find these good traits, try to introduce into the elite cultivar, we said, right? So these are high quality, nutritious, safe. We want to improve their resilience to like warm temperature or drought or salt. In North Carolina, we have a lot of coastal salt problem. So that's a huge area that we're working on in collaboration with colleagues here at Duke. So that's one example. I think we're making progress, and at least we need more support by alumni in that case. But we have a center here really aiming to make a new generation of crop plants. The second line of research that we're doing is really plant microbiome. You probably heard about human microbiome. We all have it in our body, but plants have a very similar microbiome. They really help plants to be healthy. And this is an area that's very little understood. And so we are really focusing on to try to using genomics again to understand, what microbes are living on healthy plants. Can we improve these microbes to make plants more resilient to temperature, drought? And so instead of tinkering with genomics of the plants itself, we're using beneficial microbes to help plants to deal with these stresses. So these are two examples now going on at Duke, particularly in my lab. So we'll see. These are among many approaches we're thinking about doing that. I think it's a very exciting time. Marty?
Yeah, that's very exciting and also optimistic, which is nice because in the environment space, of course, it's often hard to find optimism because there is a lot of concerns out there. So it's nice.
No. Well, you can always take a pessimistic view, but I think as scientists, we're optimistic. So I think there's a lot of things we haven't tried, and certainly the technique, are there. So we should be able to solve the problem.
Yeah. And I feel like I've been experiencing some optimism and just kind of paying attention to what Zachary's lab has been doing. So Zachary, why don't you tell us more about all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we study marine microalgae. Again, they're the single cell plants that are running the show in the global ocean. And what I've been working on that for decades now. And relatively recently, in the last 15 years, a colleague said, have you thought about leveraging their advantages for biotechnological purposes? And the basic idea here is that marine microalgae, a lot of the things that cause them to do so great in the ocean could be leveraged by societies to solve some of our pressing problems. And so by being marine, they don't use fresh water. They don't use arable land, and so we could potentially grow them in areas where traditional crops are not able to be grown. They grow very quickly. In the global ocean, they double every day, and we can on land grow them even faster. So they're growing incredibly fast compared to traditional crops like, soy or corn. Marine microalgae use resources very quickly or very efficiently, and so if we give them something, they use it all, and so we're not wasting resources. And then perhaps most importantly, they produce a lot of the things we need. They have carbohydrates, they have oils, they have protein, and these are things that are the basic building blocks for energy or food products. And so my lab has been using those strong fundamentals and trying to develop technologies, whether that be picking the right algae strains to grow, trying to develop better technologies to grow them, so the infrastructure, but also thinking about how do we get those microalgae into products that we can use. So is that going to look like separating it into oils and proteins? Is it feeding it to chickens? Is it feeding it to salmon aquaculture? Or is it feeding those ingredients to humans? And so we collaborate. We grow the algae here at Duke at the Marine Lab, but then we collaborate with partners in animal feed, in oil and other industries to try to assess the efficacy of those products. And like Xingming said, and Marty, it's exciting times because there's a lot of potential and there's been a lot of movement in the space, and I think we're making great progress. So, thank you.
That's fantastic. And I want to kind of go back a little bit to what's the kind of suite of scientific techniques that that are in play for this sort of research. And so, of course, there's a lot of talk about genetic modification. Some of this might be kind of what we would think of as selective breeding. Xingyang, you mentioned that in your opening that some of the current plants that we're growing have lost some desirable traits as we've selectively bred them over time. And so can you give everyone a general sense of what the different kinds of techniques are and how they might be used? And recognizing that we have an audience that is from very diverse backgrounds. Some of them might have studied biology or medicine, and some of them, maybe only took one class that was in the natural science area. And so maybe just a little background on that would be helpful.
Sure. So we all know, dogs coming from, wolf. And so it takes many, thousands and probably sometimes millions of years to evolve, and the human played a major role in domesticating a lot of animals and plants. So through these natural breeding, crossing this, dog and that, okay? Plants the same way, you basically do a lot of breeding. And so that process is very slow. And then, we made it to this stage. So it works to the extent that it has been. What genomics can do is doing exactly like that, but faster, because now we're able to tell very quickly what traits are being introduced along the way. Before was guessing. You have to kind of, let's say, I want a high yield soy crop. You have to wait a year to know, because you need to wait until it says seeds and seed dry, and then you count them, and then you do the next round the next year. So so you do this 10 times, and that's 10 years, right? So that's the quickest you can go to get a new variety. What the molecular genomic can do is you do the same thing, but you can tell immediately in the first week that this is going to be the right combination. And so you can speed up the process like 10 times, 100 times. And you can now domesticate a new tomato variety within 3 years instead of 30 years. So that's a power of genomics. Now, some people are very worried about GMO, and any technology, of course, has pros and cons, and so, but scientists are actually very aware of that. We don't want to do like traditional GMO. We basically want to follow the natural way of breeding, but make it faster. So anything that product comes through are exactly the same as conventional breeding would be, and nothing different. It's just faster. So, and more precise, by the way. And so that's the example of that. And I just told you also, genomics is not the only way to improve food production. We now have non-GMO, totally like a microbiome mediated way that you're not changing the plant genome at all. But we know the microbiome interact with the endogenous DNA of plants. So you basically don't tinkering with genetics of plants. You can actually improve yield, improve, drought tolerance, improve temperature. So there's a variety of different ways now to make the crop production more safe, high quality nutrition, but more direct. So that's a benefit of using genomics, right? So
Great. Zachary, do you want to add to that and maybe talk about future emerging opportunities for non-traditional mechanisms for food production and how it relates to these various techniques?
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of the traditional technologies that we've used, they're very mature and we're good at it. As a global society, we're good at improving crop yields across a variety of species. But the scale of future challenges, with growing population and growing demand for resources, just puts more pressure on the food system, in addition to climate and other scenarios. And so I think we need to be, as a society, we need to be looking for alternative and kind of disruptive solutions. And so, one of those is certainly non-traditional sources of food. And so we work on microalgae, which is one of those, but there are others, insects, single cell proteins, and so on. And so I think the opportunity with kind of the collective body of these alternative sources, and I'm most familiar with the microalgae, of course, is that they utilize different resources, they have different advantages, and they have the potential to be more sustainable or otherwise more broadly scalable. And so I think that's the opportunity. I think we can also leverage, in addition to the genetic approaches that we heard about earlier, I think we can also use kind of untapped natural variability, microalgae in particular. There's thousands of species out there, and no one eats microalgae, right? And basically, no one uses them as a product. So there's vast potential to leverage these sources. Same with insects, same with other single cell proteins. So I think the opportunity is that we can take advantage of different cultivation systems, different resources, and many of those are much more sustainable in the long run, and perhaps less impacted by changing environments, and therefore making our food system more robust in the future.
That's great. And this both of your answers made me think a little bit about um, where I come into things as an economist, and often we're a little agnostic about what it is that people want, and we're people's preferences are what they are, and then we try to understand how to make policy to address problems such as climate change that come up along the way. But all of this sort of innovation, it has to come from somewhere, and so it makes me want to ask both of you. Maybe we'll reverse the order. We'll start with Zachary. How do you know where to look? How do you to what extent does what's happening in society more broadly, what your view of what consumers want, what your expectation about the future of climate change or other environmental disruptions, to how much does that shape your science, how you think about what problems are most important to address and solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we ground everything we do in sustainability and economic analyses. And so just because you can do it in the lab doesn't necessarily mean it's a sustainable operation if applied commercially. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's economically viable at scale. And so everything we do, we try to work towards a more sustainable model. It doesn't mean we're there on iteration one, but the vision is that once we scale large, that's going to be a sustainable operation. So those are kind of the overall drivers of what we think about. But you can't lose sight of the fact that you're producing a product. And so if you're growing a traditional product, whether that be a tomato or a soybean or corn, those markets are more understood, and there's expectations of what that looks like. Probably no one on the call today wants to eat a spoonful of microalgae. No one's really thinking
I
about,
do.
I want to do that.
I want to try it.
So we have to think about, well, okay, so you can create it and you can do it sustainably and you can do it economically. How do we get that into the food system in a way that it'll still penetrate the market? And so we think about ingredients, we think about whether we can use it as an animal feed. We think about other ways that we can disrupt or otherwise incorporate these alternative sources of food into the global market. And changing people's perception takes time. And so we think about steps to making that happen, or they're otherwise just incorporating it without them knowing, but it's still being a healthy and sustainable ingredient.
Feng Yang, what about you? How do you know where to look, and what drives the question generation in that sense?
Well, maybe I can reframe the question a bit, if I can. I mean, so how we design a new generation of food that would feed the world, okay, in the next few decades, right, or next century. I think that's, from my point of view, people always will want to have safe, first of all, high quality, nutritious food. And affordable. I mean, we all know the inflation right now. And that is really important because, we don't feel it here in the United States. But if you look globally, there's still populations that experience starvation. So we have very different scale of demands. And I don't think we should use our view to go across the globe, right? So you have the very scaled crop production as well, like satisfy the different subpopulations on different places. But ultimately, all of us need to have enough nutrition, and it has to be safe and high quality. So that would drive my research, and many of scientists' research is how to maintain that and how to make it affordable, right? So, that's another issue that I don't think we can deal with today, is once you have a technology, how to distribute that technology across the globe, and not to go to a wealthy country and, poor country. And so, but in terms of the anticipation, so right now we are basically facing a situation pretty serious. We're going to feed 70% more. We need a 70% more food, basically, in the next 2 years. How do we do that, even with the current type of food? So that's number one. And along the way, we should also think about how to improve, the quality, nutrition, and safety of these foods. So each of these questions require a lot of thinking and research. And I think climate change certainly is another, huge barrier to us. So this requires not individual researchers. You need the centers, you need a global network to really using AI. We're talking about the Duke. We need a computer power to really speed up the knowledge generation. I think we can do that. Duke should be at the forefront of it. And so that's all the challenges that I'm thinking about. And future is here. And we need to harness all the technology we have, not necessarily like I work on plants. I cannot just think from plant side. I need to think about computer. I need to think about animal. I need to think about microbe. I need to think about a lot of things in the whole system to be able to maintain this kind of quality food that we have enjoyed in the last 100 years. But in the future, it will be quite challenging, I would say, globally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the phenomena that's gone along with this modernization of our food system is that we rely, in terms of the total calories that are in our food system, we rely on an ever smaller number of foods. And of course, there's pushback against this. There's movements toward small scale operations. There's interest in local foods. There's also pushback in terms of just explicit recognition that part of food security is not just enough food, but also culturally appropriate food.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not expected that everyone from every culture and every part of the world should need to eat the same thing. So I'm curious about this pace of technological progress, the urgency of sort of producing enough food and addressing climate challenges, and how it's going to mesh with also this desire to preserve diversity of foods. And I realize this is a bit of an off script question and a tough one out of nowhere perhaps, but I think our conversation is kind of moved toward this. So I'm curious what both of you think. Xingyang, you're nodding. You were nodding first, so I'll turn it over.
No, I totally get it. I think that's my answer a little bit in the last answer. I think this is a huge issue. To preserve diversity and to preserve cultural differences. And so we cannot just say Monsanto sell everything and then go across the globe. And then this is a variety of corn they're going to use. That's not going to work. I mean, there's a lot of resentment to this because there's a lot of problem with that. I think as scientists now using genomics or other means really start to think about how to preserve local varieties that, people like to eat, their grandma like to eat them. And this like special thing. They not just food, right? It's your feeling, your mental status and things like that. But actually that is where the new technology can help dramatically, because the reason the corn and the main simple kind of main staple food is dominating because a lot of people working on that, right? So you need a lot of effort to make that happen. A lot of sort of orphan crop, usually people like a particular region, they're not studied very well because there's not enough efforts and technology. Now with new technology, you are able to actually apply the same thing we use for corn rapidly to something that is, cassava in Africa, for instance. It's very difficult to breed, but now you can actually speed up that kind of process. So I think this is actually a very exciting time. Again, it's a lot more diverse consideration. I think this is really something that we need to think about. Heirloom tomato, nowadays you can actually generate a lot faster, even in the United States. So it's really good time.
Yeah, so I think one important thing that I heard in that was that the basic science that supports this kind of innovation is broadly applicable to a lot of different foods. And so if we can push forward the basic science, it'll help us to translate it for preserving that very diversity.
Yeah, it will remove this inequality that has built up with the big, huge companies in the last few decades. The Western view of food and fast food, all kind of stuff. I think that will reduce that kind of barrier to have this artificial kind of setting what we end now. So I think it's really good. Yeah.
Zachary, do you want to add to that and maybe think about the ways that marine algae could map into a diverse food system?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll relay a joke that we have in our an ongoing joke that we have in our group is that, we're essentially competing with an established industry that's been around for 10,000 years. And so the joke that we have is, hey, let's get into the low value commodity market because that's easy to disrupt. And I think the punchline is that it's very efficient. Actually, modern agriculture is very efficient. And one of the reasons that is because they focus on relatively few things and do so. The technology has really advanced those few things. I think where we can start to, but it's not terribly resilient. And so I think what is important to think about is how do we make that system more resilient, diversifying it, make it more resilient to change like future climate scenarios. But there's also the challenge of mapping onto people's preferences. And so I think for the non-traditional crops, like what we work on, there's no history, there's no culture associated with it. And so we have to think carefully about how does that integrate into the food system? Again, is that an ingredient that's used in food? Is it an ingredient or a food that's given to animals? And so we have to be a little bit more purposeful and thoughtful about that. Imagining people totally transforming what they eat is not likely to happen in the near term. So we have to think more about how do we integrate into existing systems and diversify that from within.
Yeah, and I mean, we have some interesting models too of penetration of non-traditional foods. I remember being at the Sustainable Food Institute about 8 or 10 years ago, and the CEO of a startup was speaking about a meat substitute product, and the chefs. There were celebrity chefs and food journalists in the room who were honestly kind of booing him off the stage. And oh, people don't go for that. They'll sooner eat insects than eat that stuff. And now that was the CEO of Beyond Beef, who's Beyond Meat, and it's a billionaire, and I think he's laughing all the way to the bank. So some of these things, and we're not here to debate, that particular product, but some of these things, they can change, they can be transformative, and I'll never forget the sort of skepticism that everyone else in the room seemed to be bringing, and I was thinking, he says that it really does taste like beef. Well, that's really interesting. So I did want to sort of think a little bit about, how do we how do we get the balance right between basic science and applied science for for solving issues of climate resilience of our food system, and sort of feeding the world, dealing with diversity, and I think to me that's something I struggle with, and I'm wondering what each of you think. Zachary, do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess I'd use my own lab as an example. So we have this oceanographic side where we go into the ocean and try to understand what's happening with algae. But then we have this more applied side where we're working on building solutions, using algae to build sustainable solutions. And when I recruit students or tell students what we're working on, so when we go in the ocean, we go out there and we try to figure out what happened. Why are those algae out there? Why are there those ones, not other ones? What's the environment that's causing that to structure that population? What will it look like in the future with climate change? We start to make predictions.
Mm-hmm.
For the applied science, it's the exact opposite. We're trying to make it do one thing. We want it to grow fast. We want it to grow high oil or high protein. And so we do all the same measurements. It's just that the arrows are different. And so I guess more generally, what I would say is there is absolutely a huge role that basic science plays in our applied science, and that we're looking at organisms' interactions with each other, with the environment, with their how their genome operates, and so on. All that basic science translates into the application. How do we get them to do the thing we want them to do? There's some additional steps translating that knowledge at scale, but the basic science, it's our bread and butter. It's what we do every day, even though the goal may be more applied.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think about my own work in many of the same ways, even though we're in vastly different fields. Shenyang, do you want to add something to this balance?
Yeah, I totally agree
Applied-
with Zachary. I think I would say that both basic science and applied are equally important. I think that's what this country doing so well in both sides. Duke is doing very well in the basic science. I think compared to our peer university, especially MIT and Stanford, we don't do too well in the translation. I think that's the Duke already recognize that, and we could always get help from our alumni. Essentially, we need to create a lot of startups. That is to basically it's like a bridge between the basic laboratory, like I'm operating, before it hit to the real world. You have this incubator, and the center that I mentioned, the Climate Plant Innovation Center, is kind of going that way, is to become a unit to attract these startups and to translate many of our basic finding, which could be pretty profound, to the world. And so we need this bridging thing, and Duke is now doing so well. So is this recorded? Okay. I'm in trouble. But anyway, I hope that the administration also realize that there's a tremendous potential here at Duke to unleash this basic science towards really solving the global problem by investing this intermediate startup or centers that actually link the basic science to the real problems.
Okay. Well, we're about to transition over to questions from the audience. So maybe just real quickly, do you want to end on one thing that you think is you're most optimistic about, maybe related to your lab? What's the one technology or the one market niche you think could actually, happen most realistically? No one wants to speculate on that one.
That's such a hard question.
That
In
is a-
science, you cannot say there's no black or white, but we aim to, as I said before, to make plant more resilient to climate change. That's certainly we're making progress, and our colleagues are making progress, and we're going to succeed. I mean, that's just no question about it. It's the when, right? So hopefully we do this before the crop fails. I mean, that would be a disaster. So they happened before the Irish famine, for instance, right? So it caused millions of people migrate from Europe to this country. So it could happen, but we hope our emphasis on the do this ahead of time would prevent that from happening. Zachary, it's you.
Yeah, I would say in our space, the microalgae world that I work in, alternative sources of protein, we're already starting to see translation of microalgae into an aquaculture feed. And this is incredibly exciting as a broader field because aquaculture, it continues to grow, but as Marty and many people know, one of the things that limits its future growth is fish meal and fish oil. And we're starting to see penetration of algae as a replacement for fish meal and fish oil. And I only see that growing in the future, and that'll enable a broader expansion of aquaculture, which is in a growing importance as a food source.
So I think we're at the stage to transition. So I encourage people to put questions in the chat. I see one. Well, there's several from one participant. I'll try to paraphrase one of them and keeping in mind what your expertise is. So I think it's sort of inevitable that questions about one of our most environmentally challenging parts of the food system, and also one of the most challenging parts of our food system from a health perspective, that this would come up. So the question was about beef, and that we're consuming a lot of beef and dairy in high-income countries, and that trend, as countries become wealthier, that trend extends to other parts of the world. And at the same time, it's implicated in climate change quite heavily with methane emissions from beef cattle and cows, and at the same time, that's very much implicated in health problems from heart disease and possible implications for other health issues. So where does research in the genome potentially fit into this? Or does it fit into this? Are there ways that are we going to find ways to reduce people's consumption of beef by substituting mixing other ingredients? Are we going to change cattle genetically in ways that could be more favorable from a both health and environmental standpoint? Are we just going to convince people to be vegetarians, which is probably outside of your areas and arguably outside of mine, but definitely something I think a lot about. So yeah, does anyone want to take a stab at that one? It's a really interesting question.
I can get started on it. I think there are ways to improve existing food systems, and certainly beef cattle are not the most environmentally friendly if you rank order things. There are worse ones, but that's one of the top ones that's not so great. However, it is also part of our culture, certainly in the US and many other countries. And so I think it's unrealistic to think that we're just going to get rid of beef cows tomorrow, or even in the near future. And so I think there are definitely scientific ways to improve production to make it more sustainable. One is actually with algae. It turns out if you feed cattle algae, they release less methane, and so this makes them more environmentally friendly. Is that going to make them on par with something like a chicken or fish? No, but it's going to push them in the right direction. And so I think it's going to be a balance of trying to make the existing food system a little bit better, and we can do that. But I think it's also going to be educating folks about changing what they eat to make it less impactful. To make it less impactful.
Do you want to add to
Yeah.
that, Shane?
I don't have much to add. I think, but technology is there, at least in the laboratory, to improve feeds. So, the methane is caused by digesting the cell wall, the plant cell wall material. And I don't want to go into all the detail, but there's a mechanism the methane is produced. But you can actually modify the cell wall component, which is not food, obviously, for human, but you can modify that kind of plants, allow cow to still eat them, but they will, much reduce methane release. So, these technologies are always there. The issue is the acceptance. I mean, I see a question in the chat also. It is the innovation had to match with consumers' desire. So we can create a lot of technologies, a lot of things. If it doesn't match with what consumer wants, then it's not a thing, right? So I think we need to have a constant conversation between consumers and science to drive what we should do, or how our energy should be focused on that. So this is one example is, how we deal with that. I think a lot of discussion need to occur.
Yeah, and maybe we could Zachary, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on this question related to skepticism. I mean, it's really striking, of course, that there's such dramatically different levels of skepticism about genetically modified foods in different parts of the world. So, a pretty stark comparison is the United States and the European Union, just as an example. And so how, and without saying, being pro or against GMO particularly, but how is it that to cut through skepticism about scientific innovation as a means to address health and sustainability problems? And again, I want to separate that from behavioral changes that are a part of that as well, but I think kind of a little separate from scientific innovation.
Yeah, I guess I would say I think it's fair to be skeptical of any new technology. I think that's in many ways that's a healthy response. And I think it's our role as scientists and engineers to demonstrate that the product has efficacy, that it works, that it works better than the existing product, that it has less of an impact than the existing product. And that the downsides or the negative aspects of it are addressed or mitigated. Every product, everything we do has impact, and so I think what we need to think about is the balance of those impacts, and not everyone is going to have the same value judgment on the balance of those impacts. But again, as scientists and engineers that are working towards solutions, I think we need to be open and honest about potential downsides of the technology and work to lessen those, or at a minimum, at least acknowledge them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that just reminds me of this. That you brought up the salmon feed issue, and that reminds me of in the last 30 years we've seen the reliance on fish meal and fish oil in salmon feed go down by about 70%. So on the one hand, you could say, well, they're still relying on wild caught fish as an ingredient in order to farm some other food for humans. That would be sort of the maybe the glass is half empty side, but the glass is half full side is that technology has improved by 70 to 80% in a relatively short period of time. And that's dramatically brought the price down, made that product more available to low to middle income consumers and not just high income consumers. So there's some interesting trade-offs there. I am looking here. There's a question in the chat also about the future of small scale farmers. So what role will small scale farmers play in the future food system in the next 20 to 30 years? So thinking, again, reflecting on sort of the technologies that we expect to need in order to solve some of these pressing challenges. What will that mean for small scale farmers? I realize it's asking you to get a little bit out of your, maybe a lot out of your lanes as natural science folks, but I think it's an important discussion. So if you have thoughts on that, it'd be great.
I can chime in a little. I think as I indicated before, I think science should not lead to monopolization by company. We have learned the lesson. I mean, it's just a huge lesson, right? So I think scientists are not very aware of the downside of any technology. So in terms of small farmers, the culturally specific food, I think we are really trying to enhance that to make it sustainable, right? Because you can have certain things, maybe small farmer can afford it. So it's like automatically go to big companies. So this has been in scientists' mind. I think the same thing can be said with GMO. We learned a lot of lessons from GMO, 30 years ago. But the thing we are pushing for now is not really dramatic change like we originally, the technology was. It's really to use the natural variation already there to kind of use that to aid that process of breeding. So in a sense, we're going away from GMO, but using the same concept of GMO to actually go back to conventional breeding. But that helps this speed, I think. So, anything will be labeled. The consumer always have a choice, but even with so-called GMO, it's not really typical GMO that the scientists want to push that for at all. On that side, a lot of scientists are really on the consumer side, not on the big company at least.
Mm-hmm. Zachary,
Yeah,
do you want to add anything? Do you imagine ways in which there will be small scale farming of marine algae, or small scale farmers will be using marine algae in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, so I see it as a balance. That there will be larger scale farms that enjoy the efficiencies of large operations. I think that's inevitable. But I also see a place for smaller scale operations that have the opportunity to integrate different systems. And so I do see a place for that. And just more broadly in the food system, I think there's space for both sizes of operations. And the consumers are it's a heterogeneous bunch of us out there. And some people don't really care what they eat and they just want to, get the job done. And others are more particular about their food, whether it be for health reasons or preference or what have you. And so I see those that consumer heterogeneity impacting how the food is produced, and that there will be room for smaller scale production in addition to the larger farms, which in some ways are inevitable.
Thank you. I'm going to just toss in a few comments about this from my world of seafood, and that's that I think that there are a number of kind of large scale production systems in seafood that will continue to grow. And so some products, some fisheries are very naturally harvested at a large scale. So the Alaskan pollock fishery, that's never going to be a small scale fishery. It doesn't make sense to do that. But then there will always be small scale fishers that are harvesting with other types of gear, not necessarily a midwater trawl that's real clean and producing huge scales. And those might be more boutique. They may serve more local markets, more high-end consumers. And the same is going to be true in aquaculture. There's going to be more commodity style farming at a larger scale, and a mix of that and sort of more boutique style farming. And I think oysters are an interesting example where you have this sort of terroir associated with oysters, as often sometimes referred to now as merroir. This idea that the very specific water body that this oyster is grown in has a particular character and flavor. And so I think you're going to have a mix in the seafood sector of small scale and large scale. But the bulk of food coming from the sector, I think, is going to come from large scale over the long run. That's my 2 cents on the question. As a prediction, not necessarily a normative statement. So I think we're about ready to wrap up, and so I want to turn it over to Tish for some closing remarks. And thank you all for listening and for participating today with some great questions. And if you had questions at the very end and we didn't get to, I apologize for that. Tish, take it away.
Well, thank you so much to Shing Yang, Zachary, and Marty for a great session, and to our audience for joining us. Today's session was recorded and will be posted to the Duke Alumni Lifelong Learning YouTube channel. Our next session in this series, Food Culture, Identity, and Community, will be held on Tuesday, October the 8th. We look forward to seeing you at our next Forever Learning Institute, and thank you so much for joining us today.